Welcome back to you. My name is Michael Cora, and I'm broadcasting from Toronto, Canada. I'm sitting in for Al Kresta. The show is Kresta in the afternoon on Ave Maria Radio. I tell my concern at the moment, though, is that Iran is a genuine threat. Iran, I wrote a column in the Sun group of newspapers over here, and I wrote a column Saturday, and it was very hard for me to write because I try to follow Catholic teaching on war and on all issues, but I said there may have to be a very limited nuclear strike on Iran. That sounds incredibly draconian and harsh, but there may have to be a limited nuclear strike on Iran's military infrastructure and nuclear potential, because that country with nuclear weapons, floating in oil as it is, with a fairly large population, committed to wiping out Israel, whether you care about Israel or not. Of course, if it tried to do that, Israel would respond. We are talking about Armageddon here. 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 We are talking about Armageddon. We are talking about Armageddon.
David Cox is a former seminary student who studied in the Bay Area to become a priest. He's developed a unique sense of understanding that brings him to the conclusion that there is an evilarchy. The Council on Foreign Relations, a group called the Skull and Bones, the Brotherhood of Death, these people who work in the shadows are trying to establish a new world order, just like Hitler envisioned. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One world, one race, and one ruler. A new world order upon the ashes of all people, and all sovereignty of all nations for all time.
A lot of the neocon Catholics that I hear on the radio and you see on television, those who speak more specifically about theology, like on EWTN, the Eternal Word television network, they never get to the source of it, that this is all a product of Freemasonry, the thinking of Freemasonry. They never nail the cause. They always gripe and complain about the symptoms. They have connections through their association in the Knights of Columbus, and they've been rubbing elbows with Masonry for the last 20, 25 years, and they don't want to offend anybody.
Didn't we view the same scenario in the Congress of the United States? Everybody knew that
there had been rumors about Congressman Foley, of which the majority of my class were aware of during my tenure in D.C.
And the rumors were?
Well, there was a moniker by which we described Foley. It was FFF, and it came to turn out that stand for Foley the Fag from Florida.
Then we see none of the members of Congress standing up or speaking out. They all knew who he was, and he was a close friend and associate of George Walker Bush and then Ted Haggard.
Every one of us have demons that are assigned to make us fail.
He was head of this evangelical group, a true flamer, but nobody seems to stand up. Is this true within the congregations of the Catholic Church when we see one fellow named Donald, a.k.a. Donna? It's well known amongst some of the insiders that he likes boys. I mean, why hasn't this been... Why hasn't somebody stood up?
I thank the leaders of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. I'm honored to be in the presence of Archbishop Donald Worrell. I have known the Archbishop for quite a while. I appreciate his strong and firm dedication to making sure every child in America gets a good education.
I think there's a certain political correctness about it. And also, Anthony, if you're really going to try to practice your faith, there's a certain element of maintaining charity. You know, how does one address a problem without offending God at the same time?
A norm against which we can measure who we are, what is right, and what truly constitutes a good and just society.
I know, you know, thousands of people are aware of this one particular problem within the Catholic Church. If somebody doesn't take a stand and mention the name.
As I understand it, there's a network of people like this within the institutional church, and they cover for each other. There's a Catholic writer named Michael Rose, and there's a book called Goodbye, Good Men. It's about seminarians who were kicked out of the seminary for being Orthodox. And it turned out that there's a network of homosexuals in the seminary and also among the faculty that will make sure that they don't make it through their studies and become ordained priests. And there was another book by a Catholic author named Paul Lakutis, Am Church Comes Out. And it's this new modernist church where everything's very liberal, everything's socially acceptable, there's no problem. I mean, don't make any waves about these things. Morality, well, again, it's this indifferentism. The people that are in this mix sociologically have more to lose if they make waves, and they don't want to do that.
There's one fellow that I've seen, he seems to have a dual personality, like the part that was played by Anthony Perkins in the movie Psycho. He talks about mother. In fact, he even becomes this mother. Very effeminate looking, but he's married, apparently, just like Ted Haggard is married. But he assumes the sort of a cross identity, or it's like not a cross dresser, but a cross talker.
And she used to say, she told me once I get an inspiration, I never question it. I figure God has a plan, and you see, that's how God's providence works. This is the scary thing about it. If you don't go, he won't go.
He's written a couple of books about Mother Angelica, and apparently they're bestsellers. And Mother Angelica is the Franciscan nun who founded EWTN, Eternal Word Television Network, and highly esteemed, good, two-fisted, tell it like it is theologian. Everyone really liked her. And she suffered some setbacks in her health. There was a stroke a couple of years ago on Christmas.
I thought you were talking about him. He assumes the identity of mother, like Tony Perkins.
Yeah.
It's scary to watch this guy.
It's embarrassing to watch. He's mimicking her. It seems disrespectful to me. And I guess he thinks it's funny.
Well, I think
it's
scary. It looks like an Alfred Hitchcock movie.
As a Catholic, when I see it, I don't like it because I feel it's demeaning to her. And yet he's written a couple of books based on her life and is enjoying a fair amount of success from it. But you're right, and he'll have a captive audience when he's addressing a group at a gathering like the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. They're held hostage, and they have to listen to this.
Well, I've seen this National Prayer Conference of Catholics. I see somebody like George Bush, somebody called him the first Catholic president. I mean,
yeah, that was last year, 2006.
It's like having Satan himself come before this crowd of Catholics, and they applaud him.
I'm proud to be here with Archbishop Samby, the apostolic nuncio to the United States.
I hope for their sake that they're genuinely ignorant about his background and what his determination really is. I hope so, for their sake. It's a no-brainer when Austin Ruse, in the 2006, it was a third annual National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, when Bush finished his speech, it was about 10 minutes, Austin Ruse kind of leaned over the podium and said, America's second Catholic president. And then he kind of pauses and then says, well, maybe America's first.
We are so pleased to have the president here. What an honor. God bless that man. The second Catholic president. Maybe the first. Maybe the first. Maybe the first.
I thought that was very inappropriate. John F. Kennedy was a Catholic. He was gunned down trying to do what he was doing to make things better. It's as if they had forgotten all about that. And the elements of the conspiracy that surrounding his assassination lead back to many of these elitists.
Well, wasn't the Bush family mentioned as possible suspects in the murder of John F. Kennedy?
They had continued to do business with their primary Nazi patron, who was Fritz Thyssen, who backed Hitler beginning in 1921 and who was the wealthiest man in Germany, and a steel and coal baron who, with his partner Friedrich Flick, essentially built the Nazi war machine along with I.G. Farben. In 1951, when Fritz Thyssen died in Argentina, Union Banking Corporation was liquidated by the U.S. government, and Prescott Bush received $1.5 million for his holdings in his Nazi business, and that was the beginning of the Bush family fortune for all intents and purposes. George Bush doesn't take his philosophical foundation from the Bible or the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. George Bush takes his inspiration from what he learned in Skull and Bones and from the Thule Society that Hitler and Goebbels and Goring cut their teeth in, Bohemian Grove, these evil organizations that perpetrate the ugly things that these criminals are doing to this country for which they must be held accountable.
It's an intriguing web of deceit and deception, and there were many, many players within the institutions of government, quite a few Freemasons. You had J. Edgar Hoover, founder and head of the FBI, 33rd degree Freemason, who is investigating this, right? What kind of conclusions is he going to arrive at?
Well, when I saw this prayer breakfast,
the one this year.
Yes, they pull out a picture of, is it of Mary?
It's the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It's like an exact, I think, photographically reproduced image of the miraculous image of Our Lady that when she appeared in Mexico to St. Juan Diego back in the 1500s. The pro-life movement has basically dedicated its apostolate under her protection, and that's good, that's fine, it's appropriate. But at times it almost seems like her image is being employed as a kind of mascot for the associated politics.
It looked like a poster to identify Bush as being pro-life when Bush supports Israel, who has an abortion policy second to none other than maybe communist China.
What's interesting, too, is that when Bush was elected in the year 2000, they had the delay in determining who won the election, and they had the famous Chads incident. It's a funny coincidence. The final determination was made on December 12th, on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So somehow it suggests that his election as president was appointed by God. It has God's approval.
Well,
because I've seen other coincidences on Catholic feast days as well that correspond with certain events as they took place. And I began to look at this with some suspicion.
I see happening in the Catholic Church what I see happening in the Protestant Church, and that is that the evangelicals, the prostitute preachers, those who are preaching the Judas Goat gospel, are listening to priests and pastors who are leading us not out of the desert into the promised land, but from the promised land into the desert to die. I mean, they're supporting war.
Yeah, quite literally the Iraqi desert and the deserts of Afghanistan and who knows where else.
Our soldiers, like Pat Tillman, thought, well, we should come to the fore, we should stand up and fight. He got over there and found out that this was a phony war and was about to talk. He's killed by, they say, friendly fire, not by the enemy, but maybe by the enemy within, maybe by a contractor.
It is widely discussed now that Pat Tillman was killed by so-called friendly fire, and my conclusion was that may not have been accidental. And there's plenty of good reason to believe it might not have been accidental. That's what murder is, killing on purpose. Yeah, I think there's a very, very strong indication that it was more than just an accident of spray fire. The reason we suspect this is that he was very much opposed to the war in Iraq. And it said so to his family, his close allies, and had raised the issue literally hundreds of times with members of his family.
Pat Tillman had a very, very successful football career. He gave that up in huge amounts of money, a tremendous fortune, to go to the Middle East and Central Asia because he believed that the attack came from Afghanistan that was against our country on 9/11. What he didn't know was that it was a false flag operation by insiders in our own government.
Pat Tillman, who was killed by, after they made him a hero, he's killed in battle. It was friendly fire. Probably it's going to turn out he was probably murdered by other men in his outfit. Who was there beside these military police? Military intelligence, CIA, Navy SEALs sometimes, civilian contractors from Titan Corporation.
I still want to pursue this question about this P4 memo. The P4 memo was sent to 3 generals, to Kinzinger, Abizaid, and Brown. And the memo is advising these generals to let the Secretary of Defense and others know that there may be a problem if they refer to how Pat Tillman was killed. How is that believable that 3 generals wouldn't send up the chain of command a memo like this?
The White House is just 2 days from a deadline to clear the record and its own conscience about how this administration used the death of Pat Tillman for propaganda purposes rather than telling the truth about it to his family and us. In our 4th story tonight, the White House remaining defiant about the Tillman cover-up and its cover-up of the role played by Karl Rove and others in the U.S. attorney firings. I told you on Friday that President Bush had invoked executive privilege to prevent Congress and Corporal Tillman's family from learning the truth about what the White House knew and what the Pentagon knew about the friendly fire death of the former football star and when they knew it. Today, the House Oversight Committee invited 6 current and former Pentagon officials, including former Secretary Rumsfeld, to testify about what they knew at a hearing on the 1st of August.
We know that it was an inside job. And when 9 generals are officers of this government lie to falsify the story, it can only mean one thing. This is a contract killing by the CIA.
Is the CIA an army of individuals who have a license to kill? It's like Murder Incorporated, right?
Oh, are you kidding? The CIA makes the mafia look like a Sunday school class. I mean, this is what's the problem with what's actually happening in Afghanistan.
When he got to Afghanistan, he began to discover the lies and the false basis for the wars, and he became very disillusioned and wanted to blow the whistle on this pack of lies. And when the military realized that, they simply assassinated him.
They conveniently assassinated him at the time the Abu Ghraib story was all over the front page, and that got it off instantaneously.
Could you imagine being a prisoner in this prison? If we could dim the lights. So let's go down that dungeon.
Well, we don't torture people.
Either with us or against us. You're either evil or you're good.
Let me say that again to you. We don't torture people. Come on,
So,
George.
We don't torture people.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
We don't torture people.
Waterboarding.
We do not. I don't
It's
talk about
torture.
techniques, and we don't torture people.
Anybody ever die in the interrogation program?
No.
You're sure of that?
Yeah.
Either with us or against us. You're either evil or you're good.
What you're essentially saying is some people need to be tortured.
No, I did not say that. I did not
You're
say
telling me that
I
the
did not say
enhanced
that.
interrogation...
I did not say that. We do not torture. Listen to me.
Well, you call it in the book enhanced interrogation technique.
Well, that's what we call it.
That's a euphemism.
I'm not having a semantic debate with you. I'm telling you what I believe.
Still, the president awarded Tennant the nation's highest honor for a civilian, the Medal of Freedom.
You're either evil or you're good.
Not the worst pictures. There are more than 1,000 such pictures. And you can see why the military has prevented the release of many of these pictures and many others.
About the Tillman case, what would the possible executive privilege claim be in a case about which the president has denied any knowledge?
All right. Well, I think it's hard pressed. I mean, this is really coming out of Vice President Cheney's shop, which views executive privilege as almost an absolute thing, which is invoked whenever a White House official is mentioned or questioned. But the important thing for people to understand is that past presidents have issued conditional waivers. They've said, look, we're invoking executive privilege, but we're going to waive it in this circumstance because we think the public has a right to know. I can't imagine a case stronger than the Tillman case. What occurred in Tillman truly shocks the conscience. A dead soldier was basically used as a propaganda ploy to help out the war. The record seems pretty clear on that. Why? Why anyone in the White House would stand on executive privilege instead of giving a conditional waiver? I don't know. It baffles the mind.
Pat was fighting and dying. His death was used to help the President of the United States.
The White House seems to be invoking executive privilege if anyone is within a 25-mile radius of the building. It's as clever and as elegant as a meat cleaver. It is a rather bad way to go about this. Past presidents have compromised on something like Tillman. I don't think past presidents would have said, let's fight this one out.
Like most of the military, their lives are being sacrificed for the establishment of a Hitlerian New World Order.
I accuse you, Mr. Bush, of lying this country into war. I accuse you of fabricating in the minds of your own people a false implied link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. I accuse you of firing the generals who told you that the plans for Iraq were disastrously insufficient. I accuse you of causing in Iraq the needless deaths of 3,586 of our brothers and sons and sisters and daughters and friends and neighbors. I accuse you of subverting the Constitution, not in some misguided but sincerely motivated struggle to combat terrorists, but instead to stifle dissent. I accuse you of fomenting fear among your own people, of creating the very terror you claim to have fought. I accuse you of exploiting that unreasoning fear, the natural fear of your own people who just want to live their lives in peace, as a political tool to slander your critics and libel your opponents.
I think almost everything having to do with trying to justify the war and what has happened and the secrecy has had an element of lying to it. This is a deceptive president who skirts around the truth at every opportunity to justify what's unjustifiable.
Doesn't the members of the congregation in the Catholic Church get it? Can't they see this?
I've puzzled over this, Anthony. I've written to people, I've contacted them or tried to contact them without success. And they're in denial of this, some I think. Others are more specifically conspiratorial about it.
Catholic Zionism?
Theologically, it's described as dispensationalism. It's a heretical theological agenda.
I started to notice a lot of similarities between what the dispensationalist churches are doing in the United States versus what Nazi Germany did. One of the big misconceptions that Americans have is that Christianity was behind the Nazi Holocaust, and it wasn't. One of the things that Hitler did, and he's famously quoted that he wanted to strip the veneer off of Christianity and replace it with a religion peculiar to our race. That particular religion that he created was based upon the Nordic god Odin. The entire system of Nazi Germany basically created a faith based upon race. Zionism does fairly much the same thing, and I've seen the creation of and support of that by the Christian churches, where they now have recast the people, the Israelis, some of who actually practice Judaism, some who do not, as the new chosen people. This is the perfect race that's out there. Well, this is exactly the same thing that Nazi Germany did. The Zion Nazis, for the most part, yes.
Let's take a look at the neocons. I refer to them as the neoconazis. The majority, the vast majority of the Bush administration is not made up of Christians, but those who have Jewish names. But are these really Jews, or are these Zion Nazis who do not believe in Jesus Christ, but maybe following another path and looking at another Lord, the Lord Lucifer?
A very good book to read on the subject. One is by a Jewish American named Jack Bernstein, entitled The Life of an American Jew in Racist Marxist Israel. Yeah. And then one other that explains this rather well is a book by Michael Collins Piper, The Judas Goats. It's a pretty thorough expose of the neocons.
There is a pastor of a large evangelical church. He has a huge following, Pastor John Hagee down in San Antonio, Texas, and he is calling for war in Iran right now.
Well, the Judas Goats lead the flock and congregations to the slaughter.
Turn with me to the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 3, as today we begin a new series of sermons titled The Feud Between Two Families, with the message today, World War III has begun. I know that Americans don't like to think about this, but it's imperative that we now look through the fog created by political correctness and to admit the obvious. We are at war. I'm going to give you the justification that World War III has begun.
He wants the United States to attack Iran right now. And, I say to Pastor Hagee, you know what? You got some weight to lose. If you want war with Iran, knock yourself out. You be the first to go over there and get a body part blown off. That's fine with me, if that's your position. But why are you preaching that from your pulpit and getting innocent, 18-year-old children? My husband got blown up in Vietnam. I'm a registered nurse. I know what war does. I've seen it. I've worked at veterans hospitals. I know what hell war can create. And, for him to stand up there and preach that, hey, You know, if you want to do that, you be the first to go. You lead by example. You don't get innocent, 18-year-old kids to go over there and do your work for you.
Preachers and priests are preaching the Judas goat gospel.
These apostate priests and ministers, evangelicals, Catholics, they're really the Judas goats. I would say that the neocons, the ones who are holding the reins of power, are more like the shepherds in sheep's clothing, the wolves in sheep's clothing.
Are you talking about the Fabian socialists who
exactly yeah.
Are wolves with sheep's clothing?
Exactly, yeah. It's part of the iconography of a stained glass window for the Fabian Socialist Society, the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Isaiah warns that the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. And, I think that Christians are looking straight at the wolf and they can't see him because he's dressed in sheep's clothing, such as people like John MacArthur.
The neocons are really the controllers, and then you have the ministers and the pastors, the priests, some bishops that are really the Judas goats that lead the rest of the sheep into the slaughterhouse. But they're under the control of the neocons. I mean, they voluntarily allowed themselves to be co-opted because politics is religion now. So this is the problem.
We're talking about the neo-Nazi co-option of the Christian conservative right.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, an authentic conservative Christian or Catholic is basically marginalized. They're basically tuned out by the neocon Christians and Catholics. Basically, they're uninvited and ostracized.
I think if Satan were to appoint an ambassador to communicate with this world, his name would be Henry Kissinger, and that's the man that George Walker Bush, who was in the Skull and Bones, born again into the Satanic Order in 1968, that's the man that he picked to oversee the 9/11 Keene-Hamilton Commission.
It's the same Henry Kissinger who transferred all the Nazi nuclear and other technologies to the U.S. government as soon as World War II was over. And he was ensconced at Harvard as a faculty member where David Rockefeller recruited him.
Well, now, wasn't his code name Bohr when he worked for ODRA, which was the Polish equivalent of the KGB, and their sister organization in Poland?
Henry Kissinger is a very, very dirty character, and he is the greatest war criminal in the world today.
Military men are dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns for foreign policy.
As far as I know, he married into the Rockefeller family. I've heard him described as a triple agent and by a very knowledgeable source. And interestingly enough, one of the agendas that Kissinger fostered was called the Kissinger Report, the NSSM 200, which authorized a eugenics program financed by American taxpayer money and signed by Richard Nixon to depopulate as many as 15 third world countries as a matter of strategic necessity, that it was necessary for the United States to depopulate these third world countries in order to maintain its hold on their natural resources, and to use eugenics as the means to do it. And by eugenics I mean abortion, sterilization, contraception, etc. And thereby the corporations would maintain their hold financially and materially on these poor countries.
I'm an independent radiation scientist. I've worked in 2 nuclear weapons labs, and I've traveled around 46 countries informing the public about the horrific effects of nuclear technologies. And if we don't stop them, there will be no future for humanity. They're being used right now to depopulate the world by 2 to 4 billion people. This is Henry Kissinger's Global 2000 report, a national security policy paper that he wrote for President Jimmy Carter in 1979.
The first President Bush was the first ambassador to Communist China. Before that, he was in the Central Intelligence Agency, head of it. They have a mandatory abortion program, and yet he seems to give away the entire store. Our secrets.
It's a no-brainer.
The trade deficits that have occurred are staggering.
Obviously, there's a globalist agenda at work, a hidden agenda that Americans don't seem to recognize or want to acknowledge.
How did the Catholic congregations buy this? And when I saw,
they don't pay any attention to it at all, most of them.
I see him at the prayer breakfast.
They don't want to.
This, to me, is staggering, that we would be seeing the Catholics and the Protestants supporting a man who supports an agenda that's laid out by the Club of Rome, and they're talking about eliminating 80%, 4 out of 5 of the people living on the planet Earth. How does this fall into a mood of acceptance within the Catholic Church?
It could very well be a lack of faith.
Could it not be infiltration like you talked about?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely coordinated on the inside. There's no doubt about that. And then it's maintained through media, through Catholic media, to keep the show running.
Is the Catholic media as bad as the Protestant evangelicals? I can't imagine.
They have different styles, but it's just as bad as far as I'm concerned.
Robertson, Fallenwell, what is it, Hagee?
There's a bunch of them.
I mean,
Hal Lindsey, Jack Van Impe. Take your pick.
But
it's a different kind of poison. Whether you're given strychnine or arsenic or cyanide, it's all going to kill you.
How do you wake up the Catholic clergy, and in turn, how do you wake up the Catholic congregations?
God only knows.
You mentioned Michael Collins Piper's book, The Judas Goats, and we hear about the Judas Goat gospel. I mean, this is becoming a subject, a topic of conversation all across America. How good is The Judas Goats by Michael Piper?
There's quite a few of the neocons that are mentioned and discussed, backgrounds, tactics, what positions they hold in government and finance with corporations.
These are ringers on the right. They are counterfeit conservatives. We see these prostitute preachers, and I have to call them that, leading the flock to the slaughter, leading members of their congregations into the military to go out and fight the Iraqis, and 650,000 innocent men, women, and children have died, and there was no cause for that war other than one that was created by Bush.
The so-called attempt to justify the war by the neocon Catholics, Michael Novak, was sent over to the Vatican to argue the case on the basis of moral theology, the theology of the Church.
Isn't Robert Novak doing the same thing?
Well, Robert Novak has been implicated in outing Valerie Plame, Ambassador Joe Wilson's wife. There's a book on this entitled Bush's Brain that goes into detail about it.
We're talking about Karl Rove and
That's right.
Libby, and
yeah,
Libby
exactly.
is going to jail. Or do you think Bush is going to pull him out at the last minute?
It's hard to say. He certainly can do it by a presidential pardon. If he's on his way out within the last year or a few months of his administration, why not?
There was strong reaction this morning to President Bush's decision to commute Libby's 30-month sentence in the CIA leak investigation. The leak ended the career of CIA operative Valerie Plame Wilson. Her husband, former U.S. Ambassador Joe Wilson, joins us now. Joe, what's your reaction to the president's decision yesterday?
Well, I'm not surprised. I think this administration has demonstrated time and time again it is corrupt from the top to the bottom. I think the president has short-circuited the rule of law and the system of justice that has undergirded this country in the entire history of the republic.
The same folks that are bombing innocent people in Iraq were the ones who attacked us in America on September the 11th.
The twists and turns of Plamegate, your precise and intricate lies that sent us into this bottomless pit of Iraq, your lies upon the lies to discredit Joe Wilson, your lies upon the lies upon the lies to throw the sand at the referee, a Prosecutor Fitzgerald's analogy. These are complex and often painful to follow, and too much, perhaps, for the average citizen. But when other citizens render a verdict against your man, Mr. Bush, and then you spit in the faces of those jurors and that judge and the judges who are yet to hear the appeal, the average citizen understands that, sir. It is the fixed ball game and the rigged casino and the prearranged lottery all rolled into one, and it stinks. And they know it.
from the very time of the indictment, something that you all forget to put up there every time you report this. Mr. Libby repeatedly lied and threw sand in the umpire's eyes. That is why. Now, Libby's whiners can say anything they want, but the facts as they were brought out in the court were the covert identity of a CIA officer was betrayed by Mr. Libby, Mr. Rove, Mr. Armitage, quite possibly at the direction of the Vice President. Americans know the difference between right and wrong. Americans know when the national security of this country has been betrayed, even if the President of the United States and the Vice President and Mr. Libby's supporters do not.
Did Mr. Bush just cement his claim to being the worst president in our history?
I think during the last year of Bush's administration, we may really see things for what they are in the kinds of decisions and legislation he approves.
I accuse you of handing part of this republic over to a vice president who is without conscience and letting him run roughshod over it. And I accuse you now, Mr. Bush, of giving, through that vice president, carte blanche to Mr. Libby to help defame Ambassador Joseph Wilson by any means necessary, to lie to grand juries and special counsel and before a court in order to protect the mechanisms and the particulars of that defamation with your guarantee that Libby would never see prison. And in so doing, as Ambassador Wilson himself phrased it here last night, of you becoming an accessory to the obstruction of justice.
So the president could, in the waning hours of his administration, just pardon Scooter Libby, even though Scooter Libby hadn't applied for a pardon?
Absolutely, and even though he doesn't qualify under Justice Department regulations, Mark Rich didn't qualify for a pardon under Justice Department regulations, and Bill Clinton gave him a pardon anyway. Those are only for the little people, the Justice Department regulations. For ordinary people, if you have enough juice, if you have enough friends in high places, you can go around the system, and that's what Scooter Libby did.
Well, Harry S. Truman pardoned about 60 Capone and Pendergast mobsters his first year in office. The Pendergast mob was in bed with old whorehouse Harry, and yes, he did have a whorehouse. His haberdashery was a front for the whorehouse. They'd go through the store and up the stairs.
It's interesting to note that Harry S. Truman was also a 32nd degree Freemason. After he left office as president, he was elevated to the rank of 33rd degree Freemason. And he's pointed out that this was the proudest degree conferred upon him. He valued his rank as a 33rd degree Freemason more than he did holding the office of President of the United States.
Is Freemasonry compatible with the Catholic Church?
Absolutely not. It never has been. Since the early 1700s, the popes officially condemned Freemasonry. There's just been almost 3 centuries now of encyclical letters, papal bulls condemning Catholic membership in the Masonic Lodge. If they joined, they were automatically excommunicated.
There's a book called Morals and Dogma by General Albert Pike, and Albert Pike said, yes, Lucifer is God, and those initiates of the higher order should follow the Luciferian doctrine. Why do we see so many Catholics and Protestants, like Pat Robertson, putting the Masonic claw over his heart?
Right, the lion's paw.
The lion's
paw.
paw.
That was on the cover of a magazine.
On the cover of Time magazine.
Right.
Why do we see that?
I would have to think he would have better than average knowledge about what he's involved in. Part of the tactics of Freemasonry is to keep its membership in the dark about what its real purposes and intents really are. But there's more of an in-crowd among Freemasons that have a better understanding of what's really happening. And when you see something like that, I have to think that Robertson has a good working knowledge of it and yet is participating.
Well, I asked him why he did this at the Coronado Hotel in San Diego, and I had talked privately to him for about 45 minutes at the studio that I had been in charge of. He said, well, they just told me to put my hand somewhere, and I just happened to put up my hand over the heart like that.
By the way,
the lion's claw from the Masonic Order.
We mentioned Raymond Arroyo earlier.
Yes.
He was brought into EWTN, Mother Angelica's television network, under the mentoring or recommendation of Robert Novak. So Ray comes on board with this previous background and now is the weekly news anchor every Friday for The World Over Live.
There's a picture, Brokeback Mountain. We see various pedophile priests being exposed. We see the Ted Haggards, the Mark Foleys. We see all of this homosexual permissiveness, both in government and in the churches. What's going on?
As far as I can see, Anthony, it's a rampant epidemic in society today, primarily spearheaded through the auspices of the ADL. The agenda is to make it more acceptable and to basically rearrange the moral structure of thought to pretty much determine that it's all right, that there's nothing wrong with it.
A nationwide leader of evangelical Christians, the Reverend Ted Haggard, has resigned over allegations of gay sex. But Haggard says he expects his name to be cleared. He has stepped down as head of the National Association of Evangelicals, as well as leader of his New Life Church. He's been a strong opponent of same-sex marriage. His accuser claims Haggard paid him for sex, and they met almost monthly for 3 years.
I think I had to do the moral thing in my mind, and that is expose someone who is preaching one thing but doing the opposite.
I've never had a gay relationship with anybody, and I'm steady with my wife. I'm faithful to my wife. We are not hesitant at all with an independent group asking the questions of, what did you say his name was?
Mike.
Mike, and hearing him, and then investigating it, and then deciding what should be done with me.
You used meth?
No, I have not. I did call him. I did call him.
And what did you call him about?
I called him to buy some meth, but I threw it away.
And who were you buying the meth for?
No, I was buying it for me, but I never used it.
Have you ever used meth before?
No, I have not.
So.
And I did not ever use it with him.
And did you ever have sex with him?
No, I did not.
And at what point did you decide to throw away the meth?
Right after. I never kept it very long because it was wrong. I was tempted, I bought it, but I never used it.
And how did you know that he would sell it to you?
He told me about it. I went there for a massage.
How did you find him to get a massage from him?
A referral. From the hotel I was staying at.
Is there any evidence that would prove to you that the Illuminati, the banksters, the oligarchy of evil that controls this country, set in motion a plan to discredit preachers and priests, infiltrate and dissipate the Word of God by creating the Methodist Foundation of Social Service in 1907, which became the Federal Council of Churches and later the National Council of Churches? And is there any evidence that the same thing was done within the Catholic Church?
There was a woman named Bella Dodd here in the United States who was a avowed communist, and according to her own testimony, when she later returned to the church through the help of Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, she indicated that she had helped something like 2,000 communists infiltrate the Roman Catholic priesthood here in the United States, as many as 2,000. That's a huge number. And apparently she facilitated this, and now the seminarians who became priests, some most certainly would be bishops, archbishops, maybe even a cardinal or two. Others, maybe more rank and file, would just be priests. This would definitely be part of a plan to disrupt the order of the church in our society and discredit it. And by doing so, people would lose interest, maybe lose heart, and lose their faith.
Cardinal Mahoney, would he be suspicious? Would one take a look at him a second time?
Cardinal Roger Mahoney?
Yes.
There's been some serious questions raised about the orthodoxy of his theology, and whenever the theology goes haywire, usually other symptoms manifest themselves.
The L.A. Archdiocese will pay $660 million for the sins of its fathers.
This closes the civil cases against the L.A. Archdiocese, but there is still an outside possibility that church leaders could face criminal charges. The Catholic Church made what amounts to a confession of sins, and the amount it will pay out to settle is record-setting. $660 million shared by 508 victims who say they were sexually abused by priests.
Sometimes you'll see unacceptable practices during the course of a particular celebration at a cathedral where they embellish it with certain New Age types of practices to liven it up. I mean, they think they're livening it up.
Cardinal Roger Mahoney said nothing in court today as the judge approved the massive settlement, but in a statement said, "I again extend my personal apology to victims who suffered sexual abuse by clergy." But the victims, most of whom lay blame at the Cardinal's feet, were not in a forgiving mood.
Roger Mahoney offered a very disingenuous and hollow apology. And he is sorry. I believe he's sorry. But he's sorry he was caught covering up these crimes.
The deal came on the day the first civil trial was to start. Victims believe the church settled so the Cardinal wouldn't have to testify under oath.
Mahoney's Cathedral, what do they call that?
I've heard it described as the Taj Mahoney or the Yellow Armadillo. Apparently there's been some serious criticism about the architecture of the cathedral. It was extremely expensive. It was over $100 million to build. It's a complete departure from the tradition of Roman Catholicism.
Mary, Noel, nuns, priests, what does that imply to you?
Well, unfortunately, Marxism, liberation theology seems to have made its way into their ranks. And it's quite ironic because originally, was it Bishop Walsh? He was a bishop in the Maryknoll Order and was a prisoner of the Chinese communists for a number of years, was tortured by them. I remember reading an article about him where he was immersed in a vat of water and he had to stand on tiptoe to keep from drowning, and they'd leave him like that standing in water for hours. And he said that the only thing that kept him alive was praying the rosary. And of course, they took his rosary away. He didn't have his rosary, but he counted the prayers on his fingers. And by praying to the Blessed Mother, he was able to survive. And so here you have this bishop who was tortured and persecuted by the communists, and then later the religious order adopts a Marxist, leftist theological agenda.
You were in the seminary.
It's quite ironic.
You were in the seminary for a period of time.
Yes.
You had wanted to become a priest. You went through a lot of the training, and one particular association was of great interest to me, and that was an individual who tutored you who happened to be in charge of exorcism, flushing the devil out of somebody who's embodied with satanic possession.
He was the exorcist for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. I was interested in mystical theology, in other words, the reality of faith where you actually experience the miraculous. Miracles are real, angels are real, and so are demons. And so when one reads the gospel, you want to perceive it in our own time today. If these things weren't real, what was I doing? And as a matter of fact, with all the modernist theology that was popular in the seminaries at this time, this was in the 70s, late 70s, I remember he and I would discuss this at great length because it's key to faith. If you don't have good theology, you can lose your faith. You become kind of a sanctimonious social worker. He said, well, if the devil's not real, then the miracles aren't real, that Christ isn't really who we know him to be, the gospel's not real, none of it's real. He says, what are you doing as a priest, or why don't you sell life insurance?
Those who own the major media, control and manipulate the news, haven't they been coming up with things like, is God dead? Life magazine and Time magazine were both founded by Henry Luce, and who is I would say, a practicing Luciferian. He laid nude in the coffin at the Skull and Bones and was born into the Satanic Order. Who better would be chosen to say that God is dead and try to... Every Easter you see something like this. They try to
perfect timing.
Smear and smash and degrade Catholicism and Christianity. Is this by design, or is it by...
Absolutely, yeah. It's too coincidental to be just happening on its own. It's intended, it's orchestrated, and then there's a media blitz to offend everyone, like during Lent, before Easter. And it's blasphemy.
How does the theology of General Albert Pike, a practicing Luciferian, connect with Anton LaVey from the First Church of Satan in San Francisco and Aleister Crowley?
Different denominations within the occult world. Just like in Christianity now, there isn't one single church as there was centuries ago. At one time there was just a Catholic Church for 15 centuries, and then with the Protestant Revolution, then the different denominations sprang up and split off from each other. The same thing in the occult world. The Luciferians are not Satanists specifically. In other words, they're two different denominations, but from the Christian viewpoint there's no difference at all. If you're worshiping Lucifer, or you say, well, I'm not a Luciferian, I'm a Satanist, or someone says, I'm a Satanist, not a Luciferian, I mean, it's a no-brainer for a Catholic or a serious Christian. But in the occult world, they make these distinctions. And then there's some who wear two hats. They'll be a Luciferian and a Satanist.
How about Bill Buckley, who says that he is a Catholic and he is a conservative, and he's now said, well, you know, if I had to do it again, he might be a communist, or he would be a communist. How does...
Maybe he meant he would declare himself a communist.
Yeah, but how does his philosophy, or in this case maybe theosophy, which certainly has the taint of some sort of satanic order, when you lie down nude in the coffin, you're born again in the satanic
Skull and
order.
Bones, yeah.
And then you profess to be a Christian conservative and put out this publication,
it's hogwash.
National Review. Is there any individuals associated with this magazine who isn't wearing
what
hats?
I understand about Skull and Bones, first of all, it's the second chapter of a German secret society that would fall into the category of a Black Lodge. And we're talking about the Illuminati here.
We're talking about the order and sect of the Illuminati.
That's right, yeah.
Luciferians.
It has its roots back to Adam Weishaupt. The ritual and the, I guess you could say, the occult theosophy or theology or practice of initiation into Skull and Bones, from what I've read about it, from what I've been able to learn, and in reflecting on it, would be specifically satanic, especially when they have a patriarch, a Bones patriarch, and one of them was the former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, who was dressed up as the devil one year during the initiation of the 15 candidates. And by the way, during the 2004 presidential campaign, John Kerry was asked about Supreme Court justices, and he, without batting an eye, said, well, his favorite was Potter Stewart.
Wasn't Kerry initiated into the Skull and Bones in 1966? And then
That's
there was,
right. Bush in 1968.
Victor Ashe, Bush's roommate, in 1967, and then Bush himself in 1968.
Right.
And then that story about Victor Ashe and Bush being more than just roommates, but...
I really wouldn't know. I couldn't speculate on that. I think the real crime, Anthony, is consecrating oneself to the devil for the sake of worldly power. That's the real crime. That's the real offense. I think one's at much greater risk doing that than if they're involved in some kind of irregular behavior.
Doesn't the Vatican address this issue? I mean,
it certainly has in the past.
Certainly exorcisms. Should we be exorcising the President of the United States?
You can't really free someone from demonic possession against their will. It would have to be where the person is seeking help or members of his family are seeking help, and they bring the possessed person to the church. The case is examined very carefully by a qualified exorcist. There's a process of discernment to determine his condition. Is it a psychiatric problem? Is it related to drugs? Is it related to some kind of mental illness? Or is it demonic possession? Or is it all?
We both saw Chris Everard's.
Right, the scene of
his
exorcism.
This is a real
yes, it
life
was.
thing
in Italy.
A DVD that he put out called The Illuminati.
That's right.
Taken from my 3-volume series that I put out in 1967 called The Illuminati. CFR. You look at this and you've got to believe that this is for real. And
yeah, it is. It's unusual to see an actual case documented on film like that, where the general public has access to it. And it was 100% authentic. The priest was a Passionist priest, according to his garb, the cassock he was wearing. His explanation of the process of exorcism, and then the actual exorcism itself as he was praying over this possessed teenage girl, was all authentic, absolutely 100% authentic. And the point that Chris was making in the documentary was that when you get mixed up in these secret societies and consecrate yourself to the devil, and in the case of Freemasonry, it would more properly be identified as witchcraft, But again, according to the mind of the church, there's no difference at all. One runs the risk of demonic possession or oppression. There's various degrees of demonic influence, but they put themselves under demonic control. They really risk it. And in some cases, it could actually become a case of possession.
When I asked Bill Buckley about his membership...
Oh, you talked to him?
Yeah, I talked
Interesting.
to him in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
I asked him about his membership in the Skull and Bones, how he justified that with this phony Christian conservative theology.
You asked him about Skull and Bones?
Oh, yes, I did.
What happened?
He started to bad rap Dr. Anthony Sutton, who was a friend of mine.
Really?
And he got up and practically ran out of the auditorium in New Orleans.
Yeah.
I mean,
I understand.
They're supposed to walk out of the room.
I understand that's the classic Bones response. Traditionally, in days gone by, one would simply stand up and walk away without a word spoken.
I did that to McGeorge Bundy, and he practically became physically spastic. He was just going all over the stage and couldn't talk and couldn't.
Well, I see what you're getting at. Maybe this overreacting like that, there could be something else involved, not like simply just
like somebody,
an emotional response.
Somebody in an exorcism addressing this issue, and Linda Blair, church spinning her head.
Whenever you tell the truth, Anthony, whenever we speak the truth, it can have this effect on some, because it's not politically correct.
Now, in National Review, the masthead has certain individuals who are involved not in movements that would be politically compatible with Christians and conservatives, but people who might be involved with agendas that are alien to the Christian conservative. Aren't there people whose agenda is alien to the Christian conservative movement in this country and are the masthead of National Review?
I'm very pleased to be joined today by a friend and the Washington editor of National Review magazine, Kate O'Byrne.
Buckley was always paraded out as this great conservative, and we know that he's the fellow who made a move to sell out the American Canal in Panama to the communists.
William F. Buckley Jr. was initiated into Skull and Bones in 1950. So he's been a member of Skull and Bones for 57 years.
Right.
As a Catholic, the moment he's initiated, he automatically incurs excommunication. National Review is founded by William F. Buckley Jr., who's Skull and Bones and CIA and Council on Foreign Relations. Skull and Bones being a secret society that's condemned by the church. Why is there a Catholic Washington editor for this magazine? Down in the section for contributors, we have Richard John Newhouse. Actually, that's Father Richard John Newhouse. He was a former Lutheran pastor who supposedly converted. He's now a Catholic priest. Why is a Catholic priest a contributor to a Skull and Bones magazine? Next to his name is Michael Novak. And Michael Novak is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also supposedly a Catholic. Michael Novak received the Templeton Prize. He's also an active member of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a neocon think tank. He was sent to Rome to argue the case for a just war by the Bush administration to represent a viable argument for American Catholics, supposedly, against the wishes of the Pope John Paul II.
When you say a just war, he was arguing for an attack upon
That's
an
right.
innocent nation.
That's right.
Based upon false information,
Yeah.
which resulted in the killing of 650,000 innocent men, women, and children.
So far.
So far.
That we know of.
As chaplains, you are the witnesses of Christ and his church to a new order of undivided love and allegiance.
Now, first at 5, KC24 News.
For the first time, President Bush reacts to allegations that U.S. Marines killed Iraqi civilians in Haditha, Iraq.
If in fact the laws were broken, there will be punishment.
Through you, Christ makes sacramentally present in the most tumultuous of circumstances a new heaven and a new earth. In situations of mortal conflict in a world too often, too typically marked by the absence of peace and love.
President Bush responded to what could become known as the worst criminal misconduct by the U.S. military in Iraq.
I am mindful that there is a thorough investigation going on. If in fact the laws were broken, there will be punishment.
Your task is to bear witness to a promised new world order, and in doing so, you are the nation's good servants, but God's first.
The architects of the New World Order have ways to force you into submission.
It gets more complex all the time, Anthony, with Michael Novak and the American Enterprise Institute, is that the AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, is a neocon think tank. So they hatch a lot of ideas that will promote the neocon agenda.
Is the neocon agenda a one world order, just like Hitler envisioned?
The neocon agenda would appear to be a more fascist agenda, in other words, a national socialist agenda.
A neo-Nazi agenda.
That's right, yeah. And I see this as a kind of catalyst that's being used to bring America into the New World Order. We're supposedly the last superpower in the world, the only superpower left in the world after the so-called fall of the Berlin Wall. And so Americans are still very nationalistic, the people here, but they wouldn't accept a globalist agenda if they knew what was in the works. And so the way to bring them into it is to heighten their patriotism. Pat Buchanan characterized it once as circus patriotism, where they're flying the flag and staunchly supporting the war, and anyone who disagrees with them is a traitor.
Either with us or against us, you're either evil or you're good.
This fascist agenda is being used to dissipate the United States militarily, monetarily, its resources, its resolve even, into acceptance into the single world conglomerate.
In Time magazine, we see the symbols on both sides of the speaker's podium where the president is standing. The point I'm making is that, yes, this is Time magazine with bin Laden on the cover. We're talking about the big enemy. The big enemy. I will assure you bin Laden is not the enemy. Let me show you what the enemy really is. But if you understand symbolism, Nazi, fascist symbolism, you will notice on each side of the presidential podium two interesting, perhaps 5-foot-high symbols on each side of the podium where the president stands. This is what is referred to as a fasci, a bundle of sticks with a hatchet head. Now, what is the importance of a fasci? This is a symbol of Nazi fascism. The stuff that so many good Americans went to war in Second World War to defend the free countries of the world against Nazis and fascists. And why is the symbol of Nazism, fascism, on the presidential podium where the president stands to give his State of the Union address? We see Roman fasces, the symbol of international fascism. Somebody better start waking up and finding out bin Laden is not our enemy. This man is not your enemy. Here is the enemy. The symbols of world fascism, Nazism, the mace itself. One needs to understand that in the United States Senate there is a symbol called the mace. This mace is a Nazi fascist symbol. It comes out of the ancient Roman Empire. The fasci symbols of the bundle of sticks with a hatchet head comes out of the Roman fascist system in Europe. So if we have an enemy, you can bet your bottom dollar, here is the enemy. There's this whole thing about bin Laden being the dirty, rotten enemy. I think before we jump on the bandwagon and believe anything that comes out of Washington, D.C., I mean, we have had over and over and over again proven to us the lies, deception, hypocrisy, the conspiracies against this country hatched in Washington, D.C. Anyone who knows anything about government, and I've spent 42 years, day in and day out, looking, researching, and studying occultism, conspiracies in government. And anyone who knows anything about the subject knows that Washington, D.C. is probably one of the most corrupt places on the face of the earth. There is more lies, deception, manipulation, exploitation, not just of the people of color, but for the whole entire world. The media in America are nothing more than lackeys for international banking cartels out of England. It's just a disgusting, and when I think about how many Americans were killed in New York City, and believing as I do that this thing was a setup job, because it's a textbook, as far as I'm concerned, this is a textbook operation that Nazis used, and they've used it over and over again. America has been suckered in one more time.
The ultimate goal will be this Marxist globalist superstate.
The easiest way to gain control of the population is to carry out acts of terror. The public will clamor for such laws if their personal security is threatened.
But we see the neo-Nazis not being members of the right, but we see the old guard Trotskyites, like Henry Kissinger and company, rallying around the president, and then he is presenting some sort of Christian agenda.
There's a lot of neocon Catholic lay people who are making a living at selling religion. And when they give themselves out on the radio or on television or in magazine articles or newspapers, they're getting paid for it. And they're enjoying a kind of celebrity status. And then they get to meet certain politicians. And they get a little intoxicated with their own celebrity. And they don't want to give it up.
It is inconceivable that the people would buy this. Mm-hmm. Not only is this Hagee dumb, he is dangerous.
This isn't really faith. This is religion without faith. And it's, in other words, it's ideologically driven. And it's no different than if you're a Wahhabist, as they call these extremist Muslims, and they get fanatical about war and God is on our side and this sort of thing, and then they've been labeled as Islamo-fascists. These kinds of terms are coined. What's the difference between them and these Christo-fascists? There's no difference at all in the mentality.
Well, they're fools following the faith. And
they've been set up.
Dave, Blood on the Altar, this book, The Secret History of the World's Most Dangerous Secret Society, talks about Anton LaVey, Aleister Crowley, the evilarchy that is trying to take away our freedoms and establish a Luciferian New World Order. John Whitesides Parsons was the architect of the Pentagon, which is the interior of the pentagram. You know, we talk about this, and nobody describes it, and nobody puts all of these dots together.
It's possible that some members of Skull and Bones may also be a member of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is this black lodge, a specialized Freemasonic lodge started in Germany. This is pretty much the authoritative book on the subject by Craig Heimbichner, Blood on the Altar, The Secret History of the World's Most Dangerous Secret Society.
Well, isn't the Pentagon the interior of the pentagram, the satanic star? And John Whitesides Parsons was the designer of the Pentagon, which is the interior of the pentagram.
That's exactly right. Yeah. John Whiteside Parsons was a member of the OTO. He was the head of the lodge of the OTO that was opened in Pasadena, California. And he was associated with Aerojet and also the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Jordan Maxwell pointed out that the Pentagon is the inside of a pentagram. and that the way the building is configured and the way it's oriented geographically is to draw, it's like an occult talisman that will draw down power from the North Star Thuban, the god of war. So it will empower the Pentagon to carry out the policy of war. You know, in the old days, they used to call it the Department of War. Now it's called the Department of Defense.
The Skull and Bones had in its membership a fellow named Stimson. He was the Secretary of War during World War I, which was created. We have Stimson, Secretary of War during the creation of World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I think every historian, every politico in the world knows that the Second World War was brought about by this attack, and the President of the United States knew about it.
It's amazing how this story has been buried for, what is it now, 66 years?
Well, I wrote a book on it with Colonel Curtis B. Dow, Roosevelt's former son-in-law, called The Warlords of Washington. You have the President of the United States knowledgeable about the attack, wanting the attack, and we see the current President of the United States, George Walker Bush, from the Skull and Bones. We see Stimson from the Skull and Bones, the Brotherhood of Death, and we see
he was one of their more prominent patriarchs, by the way,
9/11 event occurring, and certainly 19 hijackers didn't fly those planes because 7 of them are still alive. 1 was dead before the event, and insofar as the Pentagon is concerned, the so-called plane made a 270-degree turn, and then came in, and there was no engines.
Well,
how can a 125-foot wingspan disappear in a 16-foot hole?
I know. I'm baffled by it, Anthony, because
O'Donnell is right.
Do you believe in a conspiracy in terms of the attack of 9/11?
No, but I do believe that it is the first time in history that fire has ever melted steel. I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved. World Trade Center 7. World Trader 1 and 2 got hit by planes. 7, miraculously, the first time in history, steel was melted by fire. It is physically impossible.
He was the last guy pulled out. He was on sub-level 2, and he heard a bomb. And the guy who was filling the soda machine from Honduras came to him, and his whole skin was falling off. And he said, "What happened? What happened? The generator blew up." He said, "A bomb." Took him up, carried him outside, and saw the plane. And he was omitted from the 9/11 report. Why? It was omitted.
if someone's telling the truth about something, it's going to be considered, and it turns out to be true. What's their excuse for not seeing it?
Charlie Sheen, Martin Sheen, Gary Busey, Ed Asner. I mean, people from the legitimate left and the legitimate right are coming together, and we're all saying the same thing. This is an inside job to justify Bush's entree into Iraq and maybe into Iran, and you've got the Christians and conservatives.
He couldn't do it without him.
This madness.
Yeah, this is really the problem, Anthony, is that Bush's cornerstone, his constituency, is the Christian support for his administration, and there's an alliance, a kind of liaison or a joining together in common cause between Protestant fundamentalists, the evangelicals, and the Catholic neocons, who also talk about being evangelicals all the time. They kind of share a common ideology in that regard, especially among Catholics, because Catholic voters constitute about 25% of the vote here in America. So if the administration can keep them on board, they can maintain themselves and their policies and remain in office and get reelected, and their successors reelected to continue the policy. And so the neocon Catholics, there's a cabal of them really in media, in Catholic television and radio. They're networked together throughout these little radio stations all over the country. If they're not in agreement, like, let's say like the little ones, ideologically with the mothership, which is EWTN, then they're not going to get national syndication.
Who else was in this OTO?
Aleister Crowley is probably the most famous of the masters or Grand Master.
And he was in the theological bed with John Whitesides Parsons, and Anton LaVey started the First Church of Satan.
Well, Crowley is a much more prominent occultist than Anton LaVey. Anton LaVey was certainly bad news. There have been a lot of different tragedies associated among people who had contact with him, a lot of bad luck, you might say. But Crowley was in the stratosphere of the occult world. He, at one time, was in British intelligence. He was a high-ranking Freemason, and then he was brought into the Golden Dawn, which is another Masonic organization. He was too radical for that crowd, and they kicked him out, and so then he lateraled over into the OTO and inherited the mantle of leadership in the Ordo Templi Orientis. I understand he was addicted to opium. He was also a mountaineer. He was an unusual person.
Blatant homosexual.
I think anything went with Aleister Crowley. It's all in Craig Heimbichner's book.
So we have Aleister Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
We have Anton LaVey from the First Church of Satan. And by the way, in Rosemary's Baby, you know who the devil was who raped Rosemary?
Yeah, as I understand it, was Anton LaVey. He probably provided some technical direction to supervise the scenes to make sure of the occult authenticity of them. It's pretty scary stuff, and we all know the following stories associated with that film.
Maybe I should have killed 400 or 500 people, then I would have felt better. Then when I felt like I really offered society something.
These are minor murders compared to the murders
Yeah,
that
they
are
are.
conducted by
Yeah. Well, that's it.
The administration of the United States, the Bush administration.
That's right. Yeah.
They're minor. It's
Right.
nothing.
If you have a Satanist holding public office and can make foreign policy and start a war, you can sacrifice a lot more human beings that way.
Well, in war,
and killing them off doesn't seem to be a matter of conscience at all. And then doing that in the name of Christianity, if that isn't Satanism, I don't know what is.
Stimson was in charge of the Department of War, and how many people lost their lives? 50 million? And then Hitler was financed by George Bush's
grandfather.
His grandfather.
Prescott Bush.
So they're
Brown
financing
Brothers Harriman.
communism and Nazism, and they're saying, well, they're opposite. You've got communism on one side and communism on the other. But it's all the same.
Look, the neocon Catholics have to know about this, and I'll tell you why. As a Catholic, I'm in full support of the pro-life agenda. And as a Catholic, we're obliged to be. And if we have a problem with it, then we have to examine our conscience and come to terms with acceptance of what the Church teaches. This is an act of faith also. Inform my conscience and also my conduct, all right? As it is, I'm in full agreement with the pro-life teaching of the Church. But what I'm saying is that this pro-life agenda has been exploited by the neocons to keep the neocon Catholics on board for the political agenda. It's been very cleverly manipulated. It seems like it's an intelligence operation, and I'll give you an example why. A full-page ad appeared in the Catholic Weekly newspaper a couple of times called The Wanderer. This was back during, prior to the 2004 election between John Kerry, Skull and Bones, class of 1966, and George Bush, Skull and Bones, class of 1968.
It's heads they win, tails we lose.
Yeah, nothing could have been more obvious than that. That's the most blatant example of Illuminati manipulation of politics that I've ever seen in American history. This ad was basically an attack ad on John Kerry. And everything they said was basically correct. The verbiage was very hostile, and that's up to them if they want to do that. I don't have a problem with it. What they said was correct. But here's the irony of it. As you go down the first of maybe 3 full-page columns, they mention the fact that John Kerry was also a member of the infamous secret society at Yale, Skull and Bones, and that John Forbes Kerry is related to the Forbes family that was involved in the British East India Company opium trade in China. And on and on and on they go. How on earth can they say that and not know that Bush is also a member of Skull and Bones? It's a no-brainer.
The Delano family was involved in the British East India Company too.
Yeah, all of these
in the opium trade.
These
and
patriarchal
Bush
families.
Senior was in charge of the CIA when it was bringing in tons of heroin from Southeast Asia.
Get ready to go with me on a riveting ride down the heroin highway from Burma to Bush.
The film Air America reveals how George Bush's CIA dealt in heroin during the Vietnam War.
President Reagan has appointed Vice President Bush as the #1 policeman for controlling narcotic in the United States.
Colonel James, Rambo Greitz, was the most highly decorated Green Beret hero in the Vietnam War. Bo's search for POWs and MIAs took him into the heart of the Golden Triangle.
ask the White House aide, what about the offer from General Kunza to cooperate with the United States in reducing the narcotic and controlling the amount coming through this area?
You're about to hear from Colonel James Bo Greitz that the Bush boys had no interest in solving the drug problem. None whatsoever.
The aide was very slow to answer. He said to me, Colonel Bo, there is no interest here in that matter. I know that the American CIA used opium and heroin to finance many of the operations in Laos and in Cambodia. They financed the war using opium and heroin.
And after the Vietnam War, Richard Armitage was a prominent narcotic personnel, prominent trafficker in Bangkok.
In Bangkok?
Yeah, after Vietnam War. And this finance was being controlled, I mean, the finance support was controlled or given by Richard Armitage, who settled or who stayed in Vietnam.
Richard Armitage was George Bush's key man, trafficking in heroin out of Southeast Asia between 75 and 79.
It's a colossal...
Shonland admitted to that.
It's a colossal cartel. I saw an interview with the president of Pakistan on 60 Minutes, and one of the things that Richard Armitage told him, the current capacity that he had in government, he had direct contact with the president of...
Pakistan.
Right. And the president of Pakistan, in the 60 Minutes interview, said that Armitage said, well, we'll just bomb you back into the Stone Age unless you comply. And the president very laconically referred to it as a very blatant statement.
Richard Armitage has had heavy connections to both Bush administrations.
And all these things that we're talking about here with the opium trade, with making war, the selling of munitions, the manufacture of weaponry, which is, what, $1 trillion industry?
Yeah.
The banking and finance, all the other corporations that are making money, etc. I think of this as a criminal overworld, that it is an occult cartel, a criminal overworld. It's organized crime, but it's an overworld. You know, normally when we speak of organized crime, people think of La Cosa Nostra or the Mafia. There's linkage between the Eastern liberal establishment, the overworld, and the underworld, as if needed, or as needed. And a good example of that would be when Lucky Luciano was contracted by, what was it, the OSS to spy in Italy. And he was given a certain kind of reprieve.
Well, the OSS became the
as
CIA.
being involved, right, after the war. That's right. And Lucky Luciano was given, they kind of like overlooked his involvement in organized crime because of the service that he provided. And I think even after the war, that linkage still remained between intelligence and the underworld. But what we're talking about here is the overworld, the corporate globalist gangsters that are forming this New World Order.
You know, I'm taking a look in the book, Impeach the President, the case against Bush and Cheney by Dennis Liu and Peter Phillips. And they go back to November 2001, and Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz was to convince the administration to junk the State Department's coup plan with regards to Iraq in favor of an invasion and occupation. And then the 101-page document scopes out the, quote, sale of all state enterprises, that is, most of the nation's assets, especially in the oil and supporting industry. And they talk about property rights, and they want to take over, well, sell off Iraq's oil fields, banks, and electricity, and even change the country's
Not much if
copyright
it's
laws.
up and running, by the way. The people don't even have clean water or electricity half the time.
So it's much worse off now.
They're worse off now than when they were under
Saddam
Saddam Hussein, who was put in power by the United States in the first place.
And the poison gas that they used against the Iranians was given to them under the Bush administration. And,
George Herbert Walker.
And Rumsfeld made the deal.
He was the broker at the time.
Impeached the president, the case against Bush and Cheney. I see this belief in Zionistic fascism by these Christian preachers, and it's alien to everything that we think of as Christian.
The specific heresy of this is called dispensationalism. And basically, it involves the idea that since traditionally the Jews had the Old Covenant, they don't necessarily need the new one with Jesus Christ. And there are Christian dispensationalists who are using this as a kind of theology to schmooze everything, and so everybody can get along to go along.
Well, aren't these guys using the cloak of Judaism as the cover, just like the wolf in the Fabian Society uses the sheep's clothing to disguise their real intentions? We see the same thing, but there's a thing in the Bible that says, beware of those who call themselves Jews, but are not. Shouldn't we say, also say, beware of those who call themselves Christians,
Absolutely.
but are not? And
I think that same dynamic applies.
Yeah, it applies to both.
The quote is, beware of those who call themselves Jews and are not, and also beware of those who call themselves Christians and are not.
You see it in all aspects of life and in all walks of life where somebody says they're an expert in something or qualified or credentialed or claim to be something that they're not.
How about all of the people that are considered to be anti-Semitic because they objected to the slaughter, the wholesale slaughter of the men, women, and children who were massacred after the invasion and during the invasion of Lebanon?
After days of intense fighting, Israel sealed off Bint Jbeil, a Hezbollah stronghold in a town that stands as a symbol of resistance to the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon in the 80s. Without completely suppressing Hezbollah fighters, Israeli war machines in the air and on the ground continued to pound targets in the battered villages. As Israeli warplanes continue the assault into South Lebanon, entire families are wiped out. Nearly 400 people have been killed, more than 1,500 injured. Lebanese officials say 1/3 of them were children.
People like Mel Gibson is watching this thing and he's horrified and he can't stand it anymore. He goes down to Moon Shadows and he drinks. He chug-a-lugs the thing and he attacks the Jews, but they're not the problem.
They choose darkness for their major attacks. The Israelis have sophisticated night vision equipment.
This is a 24-hour-long, round-the-clock operation with no let-up during the night.
And all the while, the artillery barrage goes on. But each foray into foreign territory carries huge risks. They brought in their latest devastating weapon, the multiple launch rocket system. It can bombard a target with rockets. Shoot and scoop, the Americans call it.
We'll look at some of the damage the Israeli airstrikes against Hezbollah are causing in Lebanon. Stay tuned.
Southern Beirut hit again. 7 massive Israeli airstrikes targeting the Hezbollah stronghold for the first time in several days. Explosions throwing huge plumes of smoke and debris in the air. Among the locations hit, a Shiite Muslim holy site. Most of the people in Tyre fled following several warnings from the Israeli military of increased defensive activity here. Even a blanket warning that any vehicles moving in the area would be targeted.
Running away makes me feel like I'm betraying these people who are defending the land and the people and everybody here.
Welcome news to the embattled Lebanese Prime Minister Fouad Siniora. He toured a Beirut hospital today, one of many filled with civilian victims of the Israeli-Hezbollah clash. He's hoping the rising casualty count in his country will pressure an international meeting tomorrow in Rome to act.
George Bush launched this war. He is Israel's best friend. He's the one giving them the bombs and the planes. So I say to George Bush, order Israel to stop. Order Israel to stop.
Why are people like Mel Gibson so confused? Can't they see the difference? I mean, Mel Gibson's a great patriot, a great guy, and a tremendous talent.
Yeah. I think with these neocon Catholics, Anthony, they don't want to see it. They're some are in denial. Others are conspiratorial.
Mel Gibson's not a neocon.
Oh no, not at all. I'm talking about he sees it, but they don't. The neocons don't or won't. That's the difference.
But you can't be drinking and have a clear mind.
Well, if you care about something at all, and let's say if indulging will enhance any anxiety you might have, it's better not to. We're all humans, so, you know.
A lot of Jews in the industry are great people, but the people in these congregations are dumbed down and numbed down by the preachers and the priests who carry on like this.
Yeah, they are. I think it's a very deliberate program of propaganda, because John Hagee, for example, he meets with the Israelis. He'll go on these junkets to Israel, and he'll meet with members of the Mossad, which is the Israeli CIA. He'll meet with members of the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces. He'll meet with members of Shin Bet, which is the Israeli secret police. And they give him intelligence, they brief him, they encourage him. They don't give him money, he gives them money. They raise millions of dollars from their brainwashed Christian congregations and donate the money to the Israelis. And then the Israelis are killing off the Christians in Israel.
When you read some of the settler movements, some of the things that come out in Haaretz Daily and some of the other papers in Israel, you'll find the settlers will actually refer to themselves as Nazis, and they're very happy with it. They actually are proud of the fact that they treat the Palestinians the same way as the Nazis treated the Jews and the Catholics and the Gypsies and the mentally ill and others that were persecuted under Hitler. What these churches do is they then endorse that specific fact that there is one group of people who are so-called chosen and everybody else needs to get out of their way, and therefore anything can be done to them. This is the same kind of idea that the Nazis used.
I think the way to get centered on this is to look at the papacy of Pope John Paul II. He looked at the world and saw it as it is today when he became Pope, and he realized that there were certain things within the church he couldn't change or reform in his own time. These neocon Catholics, they're always singing the praises of Pope John Paul II, what a great pope he is, and he's a saint, and they call him Pope John Paul the Great. And yet, when he spoke out against the approaching war in Iraq before the war started, they disobeyed him. They went against his will, and they used this phony argument. It said, well, it's a prudential judgment to mass murder human beings in the name of Christ. They disobeyed the Holy Father, and they hatched this plot to send Michael Novak over there and argue the case in the Vatican, and the Vatican said, no way, this is against the teaching of the Church. And at the time, Jim Nicholson, who was the American ambassador to the Vatican and who's a Catholic, set the whole thing up, and it didn't fly, and then Bush went ahead and started the war anyway.
George Bush Sr. ordered the U.S. military, in an unprovoked attack, to open fire on Iraq's civilian population. Using rockets, bombs, and bullets loaded with deadly atomic waste, Bush began the human Holocaust. Knowing that depleted uranium would deform, mutate, and monsterize the children born from the men and women who inhaled it, he proceeded to poison the population.
I hope he visits Walter Reed Hospital and sees firsthand the carnage that's been caused by these renegade Catholics who call themselves conservative.
After World War II, we had a 5% medical disability rate in our veterans. After Vietnam, when they used Agent Orange, it was 10%. And since 1991, when depleted uranium weapons were introduced to the battlefield, our medical disability rate in veterans is over 55%. They are most definitely killing our soldiers. They absolutely know they're doing it. They did decades of research on depleted uranium, and it was proposed to be used as a poison gas weapon.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order. It is a big idea, a new world order, where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
Every man and woman in the military who the Bushes sent there are at high risk of bearing a deformed Bush baby.
4 days after the 1998 conference on depleted uranium, the Allies once again began bombing Baghdad. The Vatican's Father Benjamin was there. In December '98, I was in Baghdad, where we filmed the bombing from the Al Rashid Hotel. We visited the bomb sites along with a number of foreigners who hadn't had time to leave, including 2 Germans. The 2 Germans on December 20th collected a missile fragment, which they then had analyzed in Germany. And this fragment was found to be radioactive. So, not only had DU been deployed during the Gulf War, but 9 years later, the Allies were still using it in the bombing of civilian areas.
George Skull and Bones Bush, following in his Faustian father's footsteps, has once again unleashed tens of thousands of tons of highly toxic depleted uranium into the winds of the world. Bush knew it would deform, mutate, monsterize the children born from the seeds of our own soldiers and their wives. Unlike the legendary Dr. Frankenstein, who performed his experiments and created his monsters from the dead, Bush's Frankensteinian military experimenters have performed their experiments and created their monsters from the living. The horrifying results of this madness are the Bush babies. These Bush babies, whose DNA has forever been altered, are a legacy to George W. Bush, his father, and their ungodly brotherhood of death.
What so much of this administration has been about is lawlessness. Just plain lawlessness. The idea that the law does not apply to us. Two-branch Cheney, Abu Ghraib, the Geneva Accords, Alberto Gonzales, illegal surveillance. Forget the Constitution. It's about lawlessness.
What do you mean, forget the Constitution? I mean,
try habeas corpus.
George Bush is quoted as saying, "Don't bother me with the Constitution. It's just another goddamn piece of paper." Doesn't the Christian conservative movement in this country understand what loathing he has for our basic Bill of Rights?
These neocon Catholics have been co-opted, and they have, secondly, compromised on their theology, on the faith that they profess to be as Catholics. It's going to create a certain lack of perception in other things.
We are so pleased to have the president here. What an honor. God bless that man. The second Catholic president. Maybe the first. Maybe the first. Maybe the first.
George W. Bush and his critics disagree over when the verdict of history will be delivered on his presidency. We already have enough info. No more calls, please. We have a winner in the worst president ever competition. Add now to Iraq and New Orleans and habeas corpus and all the rest, interfering with a court verdict for one of his own staffers. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, now on what is left for this president, if anything.
The devastating reality of the Iraq War has overwhelmed everything else, according to administration officials and historians. There have been a string of defeats, from Social Security to being seen as missing in action on Katrina.
And Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
He was forced to jettison some trusted advisors, while others hang on under fire. The result, approval ratings at historic lows.
When we ask people to summon up one word that comes to mind when we say George W. Bush, they say incompetent.
So what is left? Mr. Bush has told visitors he still hopes for a bipartisan agreement on holding foreign terror suspects and conducting electronic surveillance. And he is being bombarded with conflicting advice over whether to attack Iran.
American people already know that President Bush is the worst president we've ever had, and I'm not sure we need a censure motion to confirm that.